What's happening today in Gaza is morally, politically, and legally intolerable. And we absolutely need an immediate permanent ceasefire in Gaza, an immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, and total openness in relation to humanitarian aid.
Hello and welcome to GZERO World. I'm Ian Bremmer, and this week world leaders meet in Midtown Manhattan for the 80th, that's right, 80th Annual United Nations General Assembly. They meet at a time when the world is embroiled in conflict and crisis, from Ukraine to Gaza to Sudan. And they meet at a moment when the Trump administration has made its disdain for multilateralism clear, not just through words, but also action, slashing billions of dollars of congressionally approved foreign aid. To put it simply, the United Nations is in rough waters, and no one knows this better than the man at the helm, Secretary-General António Guterres. He has acknowledged that his organization must learn to, quote, do less with less. But can it cut costs before it goes the way of the League of Nations? I'll ask the man himself. But first, a word from the folks who help us keep the lights on.
Funding for GZERO World is provided by our lead sponsor, Prologis, and by Cox, a family of businesses. Additional funding provided by Carnegie Corporation of New York, Koo and Patricia Ewan, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities, and
no one likes getting older. As the United Nations turns 80, those signs of age are clear. 8 decades after representatives from 51 member states signed a charter to, quote, save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, conflict rages on in Gaza, Ukraine, and Sudan. Humanitarian crises have ravaged the Democratic Republic of Congo, Haiti, and Yemen. Globally, 123 million people have been forcibly displaced from their homes. I could go on, and while the United Nations is quick to condemn these injustices, the truth is that persistent deadlock and dysfunction have stifled meaningful action, our GZERO world. At the same time, a long-simmering problem is now boiling over. The United Nations is running out of cash.
As the United Nations marks 80 years since its foundation, any celebrations may be overshadowed by a funding crisis that some say is amongst the worst it's ever faced.
The United Nations has called its financial strain undeniable, warning that budget shortfalls are hitting its life-saving aid programs hardest. At risk, efforts ranging from HIV/AIDS initiatives in Tajikistan to protections for women and girls in crisis zones like the DRC, Sudan, Haiti, Afghanistan. So why is this happening now? Well, for one thing, the organization cannot borrow money. There's no deficit spending. Can you even imagine that? Because the United Nations is not a sovereign government, has no capital base, has no assets, has no power to tax. It is entirely dependent on the contributions of its member states. And since January 20th, 2025, its most important member state has made it a priority to cut those contributions. Elon Musk may have parted ways with the White House, but U.S. President Trump's mission to cut billions in foreign aid is still well underway.
A dramatic move by President Trump tonight. He's trying to single-handedly block nearly $5 billion in foreign aid already approved by Congress.
It would be unfair, though, to say that the United States is solely responsible for the UN's financial woes. In 2024, 41 countries owed $760 million in unpaid mandatory dues. And China, which accounts for 20% of the UN's annual budget, has also become flaky in when it actually makes its contributions. Last year, it was the second to last country to pay its dues. And in last place, North Korea. The UN's leadership is sounding the alarm. In March, Secretary-General Guterres launched a major cost-cutting initiative to coincide with the UN's 80th birthday, called UN 80. Proposals included cutting staff, consolidating the organization's many agencies into 4 streamlined branches, and moving offices from pricey New York and Geneva to cheaper cities like Nairobi. But will it be enough? And can the United Nations continue to function in a world where so many of the most important members are questioning its value? I sit down with the United Nations Secretary-General himself to ask precisely that question. Secretary-General António Guterres, it's really nice to be with you.
It's an enormous pleasure to be with you again.
Let me ask you a little bit about some of the conflicts around the world. The UN, of course, is making news because of a study under UN auspices that announced that a genocide is being conducted by Israel on the ground in Gaza. It's quite a staggering statement. I want to give you a chance to respond to that as Secretary General.
Well, I don't respond to that. That was
yeah.
a position of an independent organization.
Yeah.
I have no competence to declare or not genocide. I mean, this is something that belongs to judicial institutions, and obviously I can only follow the orientations that I get from the Security Council or the General Assembly. But the problem is not the name. The problem is the reality. And the reality is absolutely horrendous in Gaza today. After the horrific attacks of Hamas that we strongly condemned, we had a response that is with the higher level of death and destruction that I've ever seen in my public life, and with severe obstructions, at a certain moment total obstruction of humanitarian aid, leading together with all these aspects to famine and to levels of suffering, lack of all kinds of health care, adequate water, adequate sanitation, adequate shelter, to a population that is forced to move all the time and is suffering in a way that is absolutely unimaginable. So I have no doubt to say that what's happening today in Gaza is morally, politically, and legally intolerable. And we absolutely need an immediate permanent ceasefire in Gaza, an immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, and total openness in relation to humanitarian aid. Now, as we need the respect of international law in the West Bank, with the end of this construction of settlements that are illegal under international law, we need to avoid the annexation that would make the two-state solution much more difficult to implement. And we need to recognize that the only way to have peace in the Middle East and the only way to avoid radicalization around the world is indeed to stop the war in Gaza and to move into a two-state solution.
Prime Minister Netanyahu said that Israel is going to have to learn to live with greater isolation, which is exactly the opposite of what the United Nations, of course, was founded to be.
He has the possibility to solve that problem, understanding the need to change course and understanding the need to, with full need to recognize the right of Israel to exist and the right of Israel to exist in security, and this for me is clear, but fully recognizing this right, recognizing also that another people is in the same land, and that other people also needs to have a state and live also in security.
Russia-Ukraine, war that's been going on for now coming up on 4 years. Lots of pressure internationally on Russia too, to engage in a ceasefire, to at least talk with President Zelensky. Putin has shown no interest in that. We've only seen more strikes on civilian targets in Ukraine. Is there still any possibility of engaging in behind-the-scenes negotiations with the Russians and Ukrainians in a useful way?
I think there are lots of behind-the-scenes contacts, and there are public contacts by different sources, and the United States has been very active in trying to find a way. The truth is that I believe the two positions are now with a huge distance between them. Ukraine is legitimately concerned in relation to the preservation of its territorial integrity according to international law. And Russia is clearly determined to have a large occupation of territories that belong to Ukraine. And not willing to have a ceasefire, even to create the conditions for a serious negotiation between the two sides. So I'm not optimistic in the short term about a breakthrough in relation to the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and the suffering, again, of the Ukrainian people is terrible, but also the suffering of the Russian people starts to be significant with the economic difficulties the country faces. Not to mention the number of soldiers that were killed.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like over 1 million casualties that the Russians have experienced over the last 3.5 years and not slowing them down in the slightest?
It is the fact, but I believe that this is something in which there is only one way that is fair, and that way is the respect of the Charter, of international law, and of the resolutions of the General Assembly of the United Nations that are clear about the right of territorial integrity. And the question of territorial integrity is, for me, a very important question. Because if you look at the world, you have several countries, even in Europe, where you have minorities of one neighboring country, the same ethnic group of one neighboring country within the country. And we see some of these situations rather complicated. I mean, look at Bosnia-Herzegovina.
Yeah. Kosovo.
Kosovo. I mean, on the other hand, you have all the African borders were designed by the colonial powers, and they are, many of them, entirely artificial. And the heads of state in Africa had the wisdom to say, let's not touch these borders, because if not, it will be chaos. So the day territorial integrity is considered to be expendable, we can have an explosion of conflicts in the world. That is why we are so keen in affirming that territorial integrity is a major question when we look at the Russia-Ukraine war.
You've been almost a decade now here at the United Nations. The world has changed a lot. At the macro level, can we say, would you say that the world is increasingly becoming multipolar now?
We are moving in that direction, but we are not yet there. For the moment, I think we are in a kind of a chaotic transition. But it is obvious that if you look at the weight of the G7 in the global economy, every single day it diminishes a little bit. And if you look at the emerging economies, China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Vietnam, every single day they represent a bigger share of the global economy. The problem is that the institutions we have are still based on what the world was after the Second World War. And so we need to review those institutions to take into account the reality of today's world.
Now, we've been talking about the rise of the rest and the global south for decades now, so this isn't a surprise. And usually when that happens and the architecture doesn't change, it's the new countries that are becoming more powerful. They're the ones that want the reform, and yet it's the most powerful country, the United States, that seems to be least interested in the institution.
But I think that developed countries, let's say the G7, have two alternatives. One is to lead the reform, because they are still the most powerful group of countries, and they are still the largest share of the global economy. So if they lead the reform today, they will have more functional institutions, but they will still have a dominant role in those institutions. If they don't lead the reform today, the evolution is, as I mentioned, with the larger growth of the emerging economies and the much smaller growth of the developed countries' economies, at a certain moment they will suffer the reforms. And that is something that they should be wise enough to anticipate. This is the moment for G7 countries to lead the reform of global institutions. Now, today, as the big powers are divided and they are in themselves a source of instability in their relationship, what happens is that everybody everywhere thinks that they can do whatever they want. And you have mid-sized powers that today have much more influence in the conflicts than the big ones. And they feel that the impunity is total. I mean, look at what's happening in Sudan. In Sudan, you have, of course, the two armies facing each other, or the army and the
rebels
facing each other with a cruelty that is absolutely intolerable. But you have a number of countries that are arming them, that are supporting them, and that are making it very difficult for a true peace to be established.
And the countries that are arming them are middle countries. It's not the US, it's not China.
And there are no instruments to make them feel that they pay a price if they go on behaving like that. And that is what we need. We need the capacity of the international system to have some carrots and some sticks in order to be able that those that violate international law, those that violate the Charter of the United Nations, those that violate the most basic human rights have something to lose.
Now, we saw recently in China, and you were there, the Chinese government was hosting a lot of leaders around the world, and they were talking about a rules-based order. They were saying, we don't want a law of the jungle. They usually are the last to pay their dues at the United Nations. They're spending money a little earlier this time around. Do they see an opportunity? Is China potentially winning in a more chaotic environment?
Now, first, you do not have an organized bloc to oppose a G7 domination. You have all these countries that were there have their own divisions and have their own problems.
Yeah.
But they are united in saying that the present state of international relations is unfair and that they should play a bigger role. That unites them. In my opinion, China, if you look at the text of the new proposal on global governance, it talks about the UN, it talks about multilateralism, it talks about people-centered development. I don't think China wants to build a parallel system. I think China wants to have its fair share in the present system. And I think the same applies to many of the emerging economies of today. And that is the reason why I've been saying, this is the moment for G7 countries to assume the leadership of the reforms that are necessary to adapt our institutions to the world of today.
Because if they don't, there are other countries that will play a bigger role.
And
yes?
And the logic is clear. Emerging economies are growing much faster than traditional developed countries.
And as I mentioned, the Chinese are now...
And the Chinese are the biggest of those emerging economies. But we should not forget India.
Yes.
You should not forget Indonesia. You should not forget Brazil. So there is a new constellation of powers in the world that are not united entirely, but that clearly are not satisfied with the present global governance structures and would like to have their fair share.
So for now, at a time of chaos, at a time of an absence of a global order or governance, the United Nations is under a lot of financial pressure. You're going to have to make announcements to reduce staffing
But those are two different things.
Yes.
One thing is the fact that the world has serious problems from the point of view of conflict, serious problem from the point of view of inequality, serious problem from the point of view of climate, serious problem from the point of view of, no guardrails in relation to technological development, namely artificial intelligence. The world has serious problems. And of course, the UN has to deal with those serious problems. And we are making an effort in order to reform ourselves. We have a reform program that is being implemented at the present moment. We call it UN 80. Mm-hmm. We have reduced, because we need to be more effective and cost effective, the budget for next year in 15%. I think we are probably the only big institution in the world or country in the world that is able to do it.
At that level.
15%, mm-hmm. Without losing the capacity to act, just by improved efficiency within the organization.
So that's what I was going to ask you, is with a 15% cut, do you feel confident that the UN's capabilities to provide services around the world?
We are more capable now.
More capable.
So when you make the system more slim and more unified, you gain in efficiency. And on the other hand, we are looking into the mandates for their potential reform, and we'll be presenting some structural changes in the whole of the UN system, including mergers of different agencies that are until now used to work entirely alone, and that will now merge many of those things in order to be much more effective and cost effective, as I said. So we are doing this reform because it's necessary. The liquidity problem is a different thing. The liquidity problem comes from the fact that the biggest donor of assessed contributions, which are an obligation. I'm not talking about voluntary contributions. We have witnessed a drastic reduction in voluntary contribution by the United States in the beginning of the year, but also of other countries that have reduced because they have moved money from development cooperation and humanitarian aid to defense. So it is not the US alone. We are taking some emergency measures in order to it's not the reform, it's emergency measures in order to reduce costs, but there with an implication, which is many things that we were doing that are necessary, we will no longer be able to do. And we have seen that in the humanitarian field. I mean, the programs of fight against hunger, the programs of vaccination, the programs of treatment of HIV/AIDS, suffered huge cuts around the world for lack of financing.
So that's a liquidity problem.
When you have a problem of efficiency, you solve it reforming. When you have a problem of liquidity, you have to cut whatever you can cut. And when you cut whatever you can cut, the impact is not in the organization. The impact is in those we work for. But what I'm more worried is if we will have to adopt, and we are on the verge of having to adopt, an emergency cut in peacekeeping operations that could have a detrimental impact on the protection of civilians and on the stabilizing effect that many of these forces still do, taking into account the enormous difficulties that peacekeeping faces in a world where, as you mentioned, there is total impunity, and in a world where sometimes peacekeepers are not there to keep the peace, but are there to face terrorist groups, rebels that are sometimes better armed than the peacekeepers in conditions that are extremely difficult.
So to close this conversation, do you feel like we're heading towards global conflict in this environment right now?
I still hope not. I still believe that there is a level of rationality that in the end will prevail. And when I see the different actors that are playing, I see that they always, and I'm talking about the big powers, I'm not talking about smaller ones, but in the conflicts among them, they always stop one step before what could be a major confrontation.
So we have to hope that's still the case.
Let's hope so.
Thank you. Secretary-General António Guterres.
Thank you very much.
That's our show this week. Come back next week, and if you like what you've seen, or even if you don't, but you'd like to join the United Nations as a member, we can help you with that if you just take a minute to sign up for our newsletter, GZERO Daily.
Funding for GZERO World is provided by our lead sponsor, Prologis, and by Cox, a family of businesses. Additional funding provided by Carnegie Corporation of New York, Ku and Patricia Ewan, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities, and